having picked up Berserk again after a bit of a hiatus, I believe I dropped it in 2020 and then came back to it only relatively recently. I find that my opinion of it has not changed. I don't know how open I was about this, considering Miura's death around the time I dropped the series, but I do think it is time for me to come clean about this and be honest with how I feel. Specifically, that Berserk is not a particularly great manga. Like when you really get down to brass tacks, when you really analyze the themes, the story, the pacing, the artwork, the tone, the characters, essentially everything Berserk has to offer, you're left with a series that does not excel at much of anything aside from being appealing on the surface level to edgelords, considering the sheer amount of violence and rape on display. Like when you look at the series from an actual storytelling perspective, from an actual artist perspective, from when you actually try and critique it as a piece of media, you find it to be a bloated mess that's way too long, that doesn't really have a focus, and just keeps going in spite of having no real direction. Like constantly introducing new characters that you do not care about instead of focusing on the actual story. Like Berserk, in essence, did not really ever completely lost sight of what it should have been about, is the way I always describe it. Like Berserk at its core should have been about Guts versus Griffith, right? They set up this great little rivalry between them, and making them two completely distinct characters with their own motivations and goals and abilities and stuff like that. And what happens? Like you get this great origin story for Guts, right? You get this great setup, and then really nothing. You get a couple of really cool fights with apostles, continuity-wise, and what happens after that? Like, just a bunch of, world building and establishing characters and concepts that really have nothing to do with that core conflict. And I've seen people, try and say that, this makes Berserk's world feel more alive, there's a lot more going on, and that, this is a huge situation. And that the world is bigger than just Guts and Griffith, and to a certain extent, I agree with that. Again, I'm not saying that Berserk is a particularly bad manga. It's one that I do still enjoy quite a lot, in spite of my problems with it. But when you really think about it, Berserk really could. All Berserk really needed to do was stick with that formula, right? Guts finds an apostle. He fights the apostle. He learns more about the Baelit and Griffith and the God Hand or whatever, and then he fights the next apostle, right? The series did such a good job creating such interesting dynamics between the apostles and the people they were controlling and the setup, and that's typically when Berserk is at its peak, when it's kind of establishing these apostles and what they can do, and their otherworldly beastly nature, right? That is what Berserk should have been about. Guts versus Griffith, Guts versus apostles, Guts versus God Hand. Nobody really wanted anything else, right? Because all of this other stuff, when you look at the religious aspect, Farnese, when you look at saving villagers from trolls, all of it is such a step down from what we've seen already. It just does not feel like a natural progression, right? It does not feel like an organic part of the same story, right? It just feels as if, in a lot of ways, we've gotten sidetracked so much that the actual core plot has been completely forgotten about, right? Maybe it's because the writer in me, because I can kind of see what happened to Miura, in that he got over ambitious and completely lost focus on what he wanted to do with the manga, and in the end just kind of lost whatever appeal Berserk had initially. And in the transition, he created something else in that sense. I do feel weirdly enough, that the series has actually gotten better as it's gotten completely away from the Guts Griffith dynamic and focused more on like building the JRPG party, right? I find the characters in the Falcon of the Millennium Empire arc like considerably more interesting than anyone in the Band of the Hawk, anybody in the Conviction arc, anybody like, early on. Like they actually come off for the most part like likable, endearing characters. Like they actually do feel like they're going through some kind of progression. But like there lies the issue in that like it really does feel at this point that Guts is no longer the protagonist. It feels more like it's about like all these supplementary side characters that have been around forever and yet haven't really accomplished anything. Like, it's remarkable how Isidro has been around since like the beginning of the Tower of Conviction arc, right? And like he's only just now like making himself useful, making himself like have dynamics with other characters, making him like try and do something like talk about his background, his insecurities, like developing a real skill set, being a use to like the JRPG party, right. There is something to be said there that they made this character that I initially hated, say with Farnese, like into something more interesting than he was initially. But like there lies the problem in that like why did it take so long to get here? Like why didn't we have this kind of interesting dynamic with other characters earlier? Like why has it taken this long? And why are we focusing more on these characters than Guts himself, to the point where like it honestly does not feel like Guts is the protagonist? Like honestly, like I'd almost say like after Shirk is introduced, it feels like she's the protagonist. Like I've commented on this before, but it just feels like she's the one always in focus. You're always seeing her like just reacting to things and like commenting on things, explaining things. Like she's the driving force of the plot at the moment, right? Guts is not doing anything, right? It's just so weird. Honestly, it's baffling. I just I'm just not all that. It's just so confusing, right? It's just so disappointing to see like what Berserk has become in that regard, and not like I don't know. Like for me personally, I got into Berserk. I got into manga because of Berserk, right? It was something I wanted to read. I was told this was like ooh, the best series ever. And unlike something like JoJo's, which I hated, or something like Ippo, which I love, like Berserk is kind of mid for me. Like it really does kind of come off as if like the series kind of coasts by its reputation and not like its actual content, right? Berserk is a masterpiece because it has a lot of rape. Like that's kind of the impression I get from people who like talk about like how great Berserk is that like it's edgier than other manga, but like even if you actually read the manga, you'll notice that it does get less edgy with time. So even like that surface level appeal just kind of vanishes, right? And honestly, like I would argue that like Berserk wasn't all that dark to begin with, but like for me personally, I just find that like Berserk, as much as I do enjoy it to a certain extent, does not live up to the hype. Right? It's just an average manga that has some appeal to Americans because like it's so radically different than what an American would create, right? Just compare this to like Game of Thrones, right? This actually does focus on action. This actually does focus on like fighting. This actually does focus on like, you know, actually has real monsters doing terrible things. Like it's not like Game of Thrones where it just tries to pretend that like the political intrigue is like anything interesting. Like I just much prefer Berserk. I much prefer like everything that did, and I prefer it. But do I think it's great? Do I think it's a masterpiece? No, like I don't. Like obviously, I've been reading a lot of manga right now lately over the past 3 years, and I've been trying to like kind of establish like what my favorite series are and things like that. And honestly, like although I would still probably put Berserk in like my top 10 at this point, like I don't think it's going to stick there. Like I already think that I there are series that I like far more than this, that are way more enjoyable, that have better artwork, that have better plots, that have much more of a focus, that have actually concluded than Berserk was, even at its peak, right? Like even back when like Berserk might have been interesting, even at its absolute apex. Like it feels like Berserk was didn't never really lived up to the hype and praise.